Both the 7900 XTX and the RTX 40 have seen price drops since launch. There's been driver updates, there's new games out, some of them use a lot of VRAM, which is one of the differences between the two cards. Some of them have ray tracing. I've even got Unreal Engine 5 games up and running now. So how do these cards stack up now in the middle of 2023? First of all, let's talk pricing. The 7900 XTX, we can find new models available. I don't know why this 2060 is showing up on PC Part Picker, but other than that, models available starting as low as $940. The model I'm testing in this video, by the way, is the AMD reference model, so not the greatest cooling or boost clocks that you could get out of something a lot higher end. Like, for example, the 7900 XTX Red Devil, I know is a very high-end cooler, still coming in below the original MSRP of $1,000 here. Speaking of which, now let me show you something really cool from today's sponsor, Power Color, with their Rede Devil GPUs with their swappable Devil Skin backplates. It's so cool not to have to be locked into just one design. You can choose the one that fits best for you, easily swappable with magnets. We've got the intrusive Devil Skin, which is the kind of the simpler, sleeker looking one, and we've got the mesh design called the generative Devil Skin. These are all really cool. They just attach on with magnets. Excellent choice for a high-end GPU. Check the link in today's description. Now again, the version of the 7900 XTX I'm testing in this video is the AMD reference model, and I've got it up against the RTX 4080 Founders Edition from NVIDIA. The Founders Edition model isn't showing up on this particular list, but there are certain models available as low as $1,100, which is $100 below the original MSRP of $1,200, so we've at least seen the price come down a bit, although it is still extremely expensive, and many models are, still up around or over that original MSRP. But again, you can get them as low as $1,100 now. In this video, I'm testing out the RTX 4080 Founders Edition. It's a 16GB graphics card. The 7900 XTX has 24GB of VRAM. We're going to be looking at ray tracing on-off, upscaling, frame generation, all of those types of things in the latest games. If you want the full system specs, they're in the video description. I do have ResizeBAR and Smart Access Memory enabled on my 7800X3D platform. Let's just get into the benchmarks, then I'll give you final thoughts at the end of the video. My goal here will be to focus on the latest games, and Star Wars Jedi Survivor is one of the latest and best looking games, although I had to find an area that was not CPU limited, as you get in some of the inside cities. This is Unreal Engine 4 pushed to its absolute limits, and here we see the 7900 XTX and the RTX 4080 delivering very similar experience at 4K epic settings without ray tracing on and no upscaling. A 2% lead for the XTX at the end of the run on averages, and a 26% lead in the 1% lows on the 4080 though, which is interesting. But they're both averaging right around 60 frames per second at 4K epic settings in this game. However, this game actually does have a nice ray tracing implementation. It's not incredibly demanding, but it does hit the AMD GPUs a bit harder than the NVIDIA GPUs, which now means that with 4K epic settings and ray tracing on, the RTX 4080 takes a 10% lead on average, and its lead in the 1% lows has extended to 35%. Both GPUs are extremely playable at these settings, with the 7900 XTX around 50 FPS, which, since I play this game on a controller, actually feels pretty good to me, and the 4080 around 55, 56 FPS through the end of the benchmark run. This is with no upscaling. The game does feature FSR 2 upscaling. There's no DLSS in the game. However, again, I'm testing here at the native resolution. Dropping down to 1440p resolution, which I think is still a more popular resolution, and you might be able to see why, both GPUs at 1440p epic without ray tracing are delivering well over 110 frames per second. The 7900 XTX is slightly ahead by 3%, although once again, I'm seeing a smoother frame time graph and better 1% lows on the RTX 4080 in this game, where I do see a 54% lead there. Other than that, these are looking very similar performance-wise. And if we kick on ray tracing, both GPUs are once again delivering a very good experience. Here we're seeing well over 80s on the 7900 XTX, and the RTX 4080 is closing in the upper 90s. So both GPUs giving a great experience here, maxed out at 1440p, although the RTX 4080 with ray tracing enabled does take a 16% lead here, And once again, I'm seeing much better results on the 1% lows, which you can kind of see as a smoother frame time graph on the RTX 4080. Interestingly, image quality-wise, notice the difference running through that cave, whether you have the ray tracing on or off. Here we're looking at 1080p epic settings with ray tracing off, and you'll see that the lighting through this cave is a lot different. There's a lot more, I think, light leak coming through that doesn't happen with the ray tracing enabled. Anyway, just if you want to spot some of the differences there. It's basically a tie here at 1080p epic with both giving excellent results, although better results for the 1% lows on the 4080, and turning ray tracing on both GPUs again with a very high frame rate, and once again a lead in the 1% lows for the RTX 4080. But both GPUs delivering well over 100 FPS. Again, as we go through this cave, you can see the lighting does look a lot different with less light leak and all that with the RT enabled. Now, how about Unreal Engine 5? Now, this game only features, this is Layers of Fear, and it features the Lumen lighting system. It doesn't have some of the other features like Nanite, and it's a small enclosed corridor horror game, so probably not as demanding as some later Unreal Engine 5 games, but Unreal Engine 5 games are here, and at 4K high, which is the highest setting here, the 4080 has a 4% lead, both GPUs delivering a high frame rate. If we turn ray tracing on, which hardware accelerates the Lumen global illumination to get a little bit more accurate, a little better reflections, that kinds of things. It doesn't take too big of a performance hit on either GPU, but now the RTX 4080 does have a 12% lead on averages and 15% in the 1% lows, but both GPUs averaging over 60 FPS at 4K native resolution here, no upscaling. Dropping down to 1440p high settings without ray tracing, the 4080 again has a almost imperceptible 4% lead. It's worth pointing out here, by the way, that the 1% lows now are not showing us anything interesting. They're unlike what we saw in Jedi Survivor. And again, both GPUs doing very, very well here at 1440p high settings. If we go ahead and kick ray tracing on, again, both GPUs take a small hit. The hardware accelerated Lumen is not particularly demanding, but it does hit AMD GPUs a little harder than NVIDIA. And now the RTX 4080 takes a 9% lead on the averages and a 13% in the 1% lows. But again, both GPUs are well over 100 FPS here, and you'd be having a very good experience. Dropping down to 1080p high settings, both GPUs are tied, delivering the same average performance, and the 1% lows are again just tied within margin of error, 1% lead for the RTX 4080, and frame rates here are pushing the 200 frames per second mark, and even the 1% lows are over 160 frames per second. And if we kick ray tracing on, again, both GPUs delivering excellent frame rates, but it does once again hit AMD a little bit harder than NVIDIA, and that gives a 9% lead to the RTX 4080 on the averages, 7% in the 1% lows, and both GPUs are delivering such a high frame rate, you would be hard-pressed to notice the difference. But again, future Unreal Engine 5 games could be more demanding, as this is kind of a closed-in hallway game. Now, let's take a look at a Plague Tale Requiem, starting at 4K Ultra. Both GPUs are around a 60 FPS experience, and they are tied. However, once again, I'm seeing a little bit more of an issue on the 1% lows for my 7900 XTX. If you look at the frame time graph, it looks a little bumpy there, and does give a 31% lead on the 1% lows to the RTX 4080. But then if we drop down to 1440p Ultra, that goes away. There is still now a small 10% lead in the 1% lows for the 4080, but this is much less noticeable. And both GPUs are delivering over 100 FPS and have basically identical averages and a very smooth frame time graph. So I think both of them doing extremely well here. I think this game is one of the best looking current-gen exclusive games, and this uses a custom engine from Asobo Studios rather than Unreal Engine. Dropping down to 1080p Ultra settings, both GPUs are way up there, way over 100 FPS now. The 4080 does technically have a 3% lead, but we're talking like 170 versus 160 something, you know. And the 1% lows are pretty much the same, a 5% lead on the 4080. You wouldn't really notice a difference here between either GPU. And again, the frame time graph and the 1% lows are looking good on the 7900 XTX here. So not quite sure what our issue was at 4K. Now let's jump into some PlayStation 5 exclusives, like The Last of Us Part 1 at 4K Ultra. And this is on patch 1.1. This is a very recent patch that has done a lot to improve the game, especially in the CPU usage, some GPU performance. The shader optimization doesn't take a half hour anymore, although it's still fairly long. Anyway, we're seeing the RTX 4080 with a 10% lead here on averages, 14% in the 1% lows, but the 7900 XTX is averaging right about 60 FPS, and the 4080 is just a little higher at around 65 or 66. This game uses a lot of VRAM, but it did not go over the 16 gigabytes that the 4080 had, and dropping down to 1440p Ultra settings drops the VRAM usage again, closer to 10 gigabytes here, goes a bit over as we get a little further into the game. Here we're seeing the 4080 with a 20% lead on averages, though, which seems like a pretty big lead given we're not using ray tracing, but that is the result that I'm seeing here. But the 1% lows are closer to a tie. Both GPUs giving an excellent experience here, with the 7900 XTX averaging over 95 FPS, but we're over 115 on the 4080. Now, if we drop down to 1080p resolution, we're seeing very high frame rates on both GPUs, but the 4080 does take a 27% lead here on the averages. But now the 7900 XTX actually has a lead in the 1% lows by 11%. If I had to guess what's going on there, I actually think the 4080 is getting a little bit CPU limited. NVIDIA GPUs tend to have more driver overhead and get CPU limited at a lower number, which might be affecting the 1% lows and getting you a little bit more stutters on the frame time graph. Now, let's take a look at another PlayStation 5 exclusive game that's been ported to PC with Forspoken, and we're going to look at its ultra-high preset, which does include some ray tracing. And actually, interestingly, despite ray tracing being included here, we're seeing the 4080 with only a 5% lead over the 7900 XTX. The 4080 averaging right around 60 FPS, and the 7900 XTX, closer to 57 or 58 FPS, right around there. And if we drop down to 1440p at those same settings, we're now seeing both GPUs closer to 100 FPS with only a 3% lead to the 4080. Here, both frame time graphs are looking pretty smooth. I can't really report on the 1% lows through this benchmark run, though, because it goes through load screens that just completely destroy the 1% lows and make it kind of meaningless by the end of the benchmark run. And dropping down to 1080p again at the maximum settings, we're seeing both GPUs over 130 frames per second, and again, only a small 5% lead for the 4080. So I did think it was kind of interesting here that even at the max settings, including ray tracing here, we didn't see a larger lead for the 4080, despite the ray tracing being included, but that is what we got. Now let's switch over to one last PlayStation 5 exclusive with Returnal at its 4K Epic settings. The Epic preset does not include ray tracing, although the game itself does. I just stuck to the highest preset with Epic. And the 7900 XTX actually has a lead here by 9% on averages and 3% in the 1% lows, and both GPUs delivering a high refresh rate 4K Epic settings experience here, with over 90 FPS on the 7900 XTX and in the mid-80s on the 4080. If we drop down to the Epic preset, stay at the Epic preset, but drop down to 1440p resolution, there we go. The 7900 XTX increases its lead to 11% on average and 9% in the 1% lows. And that's giving it a over 150 FPS average with the 4080 in the mid 130 range, kind of upper mid there. Again, 11% lead for the 7900 XTX, although both GPUs delivering an excellent experience. And if we drop down to 1080p resolution, the 7900 XTX has a 10% lead on the averages and an 8% lead on the 1% lows. And that's basically the difference between pushing right up against 194, 195 FPS versus being pushing up closer to 180 or so FPS range. Both GPUs delivering excellent frame rates in this game. Also, this game is a lot less VRAM hungry than the other PS5 exclusives that we took a look at. Now, getting into some cross-gen games, starting with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which uses the same graphics engine as Warzone 2, so if you're interested in how GPUs would perform there, this would give you about the same results. We're seeing a massive 27% lead for the 7900 XTX on the averages and 28% in the 1% lows. This is a major victory for the 7900 XTX, although it certainly is an outlier. This is a very popular game, so if you're interested mostly in just playing some Modern Warfare or some Warzone 2, definitely take a look at these results when you make your decision. Dropping down to 1440p, by the way, I'm using the balanced preset here rather than the extremes, and that's closer to how I think people would actually use the game. The 7900 XTX is closing in on around 277, almost 280 FPS now. The 4080 down at 217, so still a very good experience, but it is a 27% lead on the averages for the 7900 XTX and a 21% lead in the 1% lows. So once again, both giving a great result, but the 7900 XTX is certainly a step ahead of the 4080 in this game. If we drop down to 1080p balanced preset, we now see a 26% lead for the 7900 XTX, which is amazingly now closing in around the 350 FPS mark. And the RTX 4080 is still doing extremely well, but we're talking closer to 280. Again, 26% lead on the averages for the 7900 XTX and a 7% lead in the 1% lows for the 7900 XTX. It's possible that the 1% lows have a bit of a smaller lead than it did before because maybe the CPU is entering a little bit more into the equation on that extremely high 350 or more FPS range. Now let's jump into another cross-gen title. This is Resident Evil 4 Remake at 4K max settings, which include ray tracing, which is why I was surprised to see the 7900 XTX winning by 1%, although, I mean, this is basically a tie. I'm wondering if this is VRAM related, because you can actually see the 7900 XTX allocating, although not reporting usage, of over 16 gigabytes here, so maybe that's helping it a little bit. And if we switch off of the max preset and go down to prioritize graphics preset, which does not have ray tracing and reins in a lot of the heavy VRAM usage, we're now seeing the 7900 XTX extend its lead to 4% without the ray tracing enabled, but the 4080 has a small lead in the 1% lows of 8%, both of them with a pretty smooth frame time graph, 1% lows over 90 on both of them. So very good results overall here, and that's at 4K resolution. If we drop down to 1440p resolution, go back to the maximum preset, which again includes some ray tracing, now we see the more expected result with ray tracing enabled, where the 4080 takes the lead, this time by 11% in both the averages and the 1% lows. Both GPUs delivering an excellent frame rate, though. We're at well over 130 FPS on the 7900 XTX and 150 FPS on the 4080. And even the 1% lows are very, very high, looking good on those results. If we drop down to the prioritize graphics preset, which again does not include any ray tracing, we now see the 4080 only winning by 2%, and the 7900 XTX has a lead by 3% in the 1% lows. So in other words, I'd basically call this a tie. They're both giving you around 200 FPS at the 1440p prioritized graphics. Interesting to note, in this game, I would actually personally turn the ray tracing off, which I did even on my 4090, because I just didn't like the look of it. It looks very, I don't know, the ray trace reflections in this game look very grainy and distracting. I also turn off the screen space reflections because I honestly think the low-res cube maps end up looking less distracting. But anyway, at 1080p max settings, which again includes ray tracing, the 4080 is winning by 11%, but they're tied in the 1% lows. The 7900 XTX is delivering over 160 FPS, and the 4080 is closer to 180 FPS. Both GPUs, again, very high refresh rate, great experience here on both of them. If we drop down to the prioritized graphics preset, which does not include ray tracing, we do see the 4080 winning by 3%, which again is basically a tie here. They're both very high frame rates. And now the 7900 XTX is winning by 16% in the 1% lows. What do I think is going on here? I think it's the CPU limit we're bumping into. And again, the CPU limitations are less dramatic on an AMD GPU than they are on an NVIDIA GPU, which has more CPU overhead. Now, let's jump into one more cross-gen game with Cyberpunk, which I'm mainly interested in using as a heavy ray tracing benchmark, but we can also use it just as a non-ray trace benchmark at 4K Ultra with no ray tracing and no upscaling. The 7900 XTX is ahead by 8% on average and 14% in the 1% lows. The 4080 averages right at 60 FPS, and the 7900 XTX is up in the mid-60s. If we drop down to 1440p ultra settings, now both GPUs are delivering a high refresh rate experience with no upscaling required. It's a 6% lead on average for the 7900 XTX and 11% in the 1% lows. And again, that's over 130 FPS on the XTX and in the mid 120s on the 4080. So again, both of them delivering a very good experience here at 1440p Ultra. But the main reason why I wanted to test out this game was as a heavy ray tracing benchmark. We saw some lighter ray tracing workloads through the other games, but there are some games like this that are just designed for a very heavy ray tracing workload. And when that happens, the 4080 does take a more noticeable lead. At 1440p RT Ultra, the 4080 averages just slightly under 60 FPS, with the 7900 XTX a little under 40 or actually right at 40 FPS by the end of the run. It's a 45% lead for the 4080 and 42% in the 1% lows. However, both those frame rates were a bit low, so really heavy ray tracing workloads like this are designed to be accompanied with upscaling techniques. So here we're using FSR2 quality on the 7900 XTX, which does boost it to an over 60 FPS experience at 1440p RT Ultra. DLSS quality takes the 4080 to almost a 100 FPS experience. So it has a 48% lead over the 7900 XTX and a 32% in the 1% lows. Now that's not including frame generation. Some games like Cyberpunk do also include the new DLSS3 frame generation, where if we enable that as well, we can see the 4080 closing in at around 150 frames per second. However, keep in mind, if you look at the very bottom of the screen, I intentionally am showing the latency counter, just so that you are aware that there is an increase to latency when using frame generation rather than a decrease, which happens when you have like real frames. And the image quality can have some issues, especially with HUD elements, things like that. Although I will say at this high of a frame rate, I do think that frame generation works very well. The latency does not feel bad, and the image quality is very good. At 4K resolution, though, here, the frame generation is a little more questionable. I still think I'd prefer to put it on, but because you have the lower base frame rate, you can see the average PC latency going up higher than what we were seeing at the high frame rate 1440p numbers. For me, 50 milliseconds is kind of a borderline of where I'm feeling good about it, and this does cross that line a little bit. Also, the lower the frame rate, the larger there is a difference between every frame, which means there can be a little more artifacts between the generated frames, which are placed between two real frames. However, it is still an interesting feature and does work pretty well here at these settings. Overall, with just DLSS quality, the 4080 is a bit under 60 FPS, although playable. The 7900 XTX is down in the 30s. It's a 42% lead without frame generation for the 4080 and a 38% lead in the 1% lows. So definitely showing off the increased ray tracing abilities here. However, if you're looking for a higher refresh rate experience, you could use more aggressive upscaling. Now, personally, I think DLSS quality at 4K can look very good. DLSS performance at 4K, I think, and I'm on a very large 4K screen, so maybe on a smaller one I would have less objections to it, but I'm not a huge fan of this. Also, I think at the performance level, the FSR2 upscaling starts to have more noticeable image quality downsides compared to DLSS upscaling, so that's another thing to take a look at. I think in some of the fine details, especially in motion, DLSS does have a cleaner reconstruction here. Again, without frame generation, it's a 42% lead for the 4080, and it is able to average in the upper 70s, pushing towards 80 FPS. The 7900 XTX gets close to, but doesn't quite hit 60 FPS, more like in the mid-50s. And then with frame generation, I think we are at a high enough frame rate to use it here very comfortably. The 4080 actually gets a nice high refresh rate look to the motion on the monitor, so it can take advantage of the high refresh rate monitor. Now, there's also a few games now, not many, but Cyberpunk is one of them, that have a path tracing update. And so I thought I'd take a look at that with the RT Overdrive mode here at 1440p. And even with upscaling enabled at DLSS quality, the 4080 is going to be well below 60 FPS at times. although does get close to it and is fairly playable. You can also enable frame generation on the 4080, which helps smooth out the look on your monitor. The latency doesn't feel too bad with this high of a base frame rate, so overall, I think this is actually a somewhat reasonable way to play the game if you'd like to, with DLSS quality and frame generation enabled. Path tracing is just too much, and also probably just not optimized at all for the AMD GPUs here, and just too much for it. So this is not a way that you'd probably want to play the game on the 7900 XTX, which is expected. I just did want to show the results here in case anybody was interested. I did also test it out down at 1080p just to see what would happen. Again, with the quality upscaling enabled, the 4080 is able to average now over 80 FPS without frame generation, and frame generation then takes it well up into the high refresh rate monitor territory. FSR2 quality on the 7900 XTX can get it over a 30 FPS average, so you can at least maybe play with it just to take a look at what path tracing looks like. Although again, at the lower resolutions, I do think the upscaling looks a lot more stable using DLSS than it does for AMD. So basically our last end of the benchmarks here is kind of showing, okay, so why does NVIDIA want to charge more for their 4080 when otherwise they perform very similarly? It's features like this: heavy-duty ray tracing, path tracing, better looking upscaling with features like frame generation. That's where the upsell is. You need to decide how much of that matters to you. Okay, so some final thoughts. First of all, let me divide some numbers on a calculator because I'm a math teacher and that's the kind of thing that I do. If I move my fat head out of the way, we get 1,200 divided by 1,000. That's the MSRP prices, which gives you 1.2. What does that mean? That means that at their original MSRPs, the RTX 4080 was 20% more expensive, or 1.2 times the price of the 7900 XTX. And at current lowest pricing that I could find new, we'd have $1,100 versus $940. And if I divide those, we get 1.17, which is very similar, although does mean that the 4080 has fallen slightly more relative to its MSRP when you compare them. In other words, it's now 17% more expensive than the 7900 XTX. So what do you get for the money? What were the differences that we saw overall? Well, with ray tracing enabled, like we're seeing here, in games that don't have an incredibly heavy ray tracing workload, we see the 4080 winning by around 10% or so. When ray tracing is turned off, we see the 4080 a lot of times behind or about tied. So basically, you're spending current market lowest prices 17% more, or at MSRP about 20% more money, to get about 10% better performance in games with light ray tracing workloads, and about the same performance in games with no ray tracing turned on at all. If that was the only benefits for the 4080, it would certainly seem like a bad deal. Just buy yourself the cheaper card. However, that wasn't the only benefit. We did notice at the end of the video, when I looked into things like, here, let me slide myself out of the way. When we look at heavy-duty ray tracing workloads, we see more an over 40% lead for the 4080. And also the image upscaling techniques. At 4K resolution, FSR2 quality does look quite good. I think DLSS quality has a slight edge, but when you use it more aggressively, like jumping into the performance settings, again, I'm not sure how well this comes through in YouTube videos due to all the compression, and you might not have a 4K screen, but other people have done videos, and I've even done videos talking more about the image quality comparisons. I do think DLSS, especially when used at more aggressive settings like this, does do a better job of reconstructing the image, which then does make it more usable. You might be more likely to use that. And then there's the whole frame generation business, which I think is a nice to have, but situationally useful feature. Frame generation, because, again, at the bottom of the screen, you can see way down here, I'm peeking at it, the latency, and there's latency over here. You can see that even though normally when frame rate goes up, latency goes down, that's what makes the game feel more responsive. Frame generation isn't like that. Latency goes up because it slightly delays showing you a new real frame in order to insert a generated frame in between. The benefit of this is in motion on a high refresh rate monitor, the image will look a lot smoother in motion. It will look like a higher frame rate, but not necessarily feel like a higher frame rate. If the base frame rate is high enough, it can still feel very good in single player games and be very usable. What we're seeing in this particular test right here with RT Overdrive, I think is kind of right at the borderline of where I think frame generation feels good or not, and might be a personal preference thing. If you're on 50 or 60 FPS, basically if you look at the latency counter down here, I found in my own personal testing, I've played around with this a lot, in most games, 50 milliseconds kind of feels like my cutoff there on what feels good. So if we can stay below 50 milliseconds of latency in a single player game, I'm usually pretty happy. And again, the base frame rate being high enough also helps the image quality because there's less difference between the two frames that are actually made by the game engine for the generated algorithm to try to interpret what would be happening in between. That kind of thing. Anyway, so I think frame generation is a nice to have, but only situational feature, which is also my thoughts on like extreme ray tracing or like the path tracing like this RT Overdrive that we're seeing here. Most games don't have ray tracing settings this demanding, and then would you even want to use them when they are available is another question mark, because I think there's diminishing returns on how much better the game looks given the performance hit and the amount of upscaling and frame generation and things that have to be enabled in order to get it to function usably. However, that being said, I do think it's fun to play around with like some of the RT Remix games. There's the RT Overdrive mode here, which again, 1440p right here, DLSS quality plus frame generation is getting a reasonable experience for playing this if you want to play it that way. Again, just something that the 7900 XTX isn't really going to get you. Now, the 7900 XTX, other than its better price, the main advantage it had was increased VRAM capacity. Now I'm going to pause this one right here. I think the only place I saw in my current testing where I felt like I might have seen the 16 gigabytes of VRAM helping in a current game that actually exists is right here in Resident Evil 4 Remake at 4K max preset, where we include the ray tracing. So here, if we look over at the, let's see, how should I point? Let's point over here. This is VRAM allocation, not actual usage. This is per process usage. So we're seeing per process usage of about 13 gigabytes and about 16.5 allocated. Whereas on the 4080, we're seeing 13 gigabytes allocated and about 12 gigabytes actually reported as used. So it's not necessarily going over the 16 gigabytes as actually being required here. And it's not like the 4080 is having significantly worse performance. The reason why I think it might be playing in a little bit here is just because the 7900 XTX is actually delivering better performance here, only by 1%, but usually with ray tracing enabled, we would see closer to a 10% lead on a light ray tracing workload like this one, which is exactly what we see when we drop down to 1440p max preset with the ray tracing here, where we now see that the 4080 has the 11% lead over the 7900 XTX with the ray tracing able, more like what we would expect. And now notice that while the VRAM allocation is high here, it doesn't allocate more than 16 on the even on the XTX, which has it. So basically, my conclusion is in current games, at 1440p resolution, I didn't see any issues with 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And at 4K resolution, I maybe saw one tiny thing that could have been VRAM related, and that's about it. In other words, 16 gigabytes of VRAM seems like plenty for now. The only question would be for how much longer. Now, I think that's a more pressing question on lower VRAM considerations. If you're talking about 12 gigabytes versus 20 gigabytes like we see when we step down a tier of cards for like the 4070 Ti versus the 7900 XT, that's a more compelling question because a lot of VRAM usage I think is related to what consoles do, right? Video game consoles have 16 gigabytes of total system unified system memory. Less than 16 is actually available for usage as VRAM, which means that a lot of games are probably going to be designed in something like a 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer, and definitely under 16 if that's the total console usage. Now, PC games can then sometimes push graphic settings beyond what the consoles can deliver, maybe higher resolutions. A lot of times consoles, even if they're outputting a 4K result, it's a lot of times upscaled, right? Which does increase the VRAM usage. A lot of times PCs will offer higher ray tracing settings, which can increase VRAM usage, things like that. In other words, I'm not saying I don't think that we'll see games going over 16 gigabytes of VRAM in this console cycle, but I am saying that I think it's going to be a lot less likely than we are to see things going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is already happening, and pushing right up against or even over 12 gigabytes of VRAM like we're seeing right here. Right? We're already over 12 in some situations, and these are very new VRAM-heavy titles. So basically, how should I put this? I think that the main advantage of the 7900 XTX is its price and its VRAM. Its VRAM might be more useful in the distant future, but doesn't seem to be that much of an issue right now. And its price is something right now. It does just cost less money. If you can't go over $1,000, right, then the 7900 XTX certainly is going to be the best GPU you can get under $1,000. If you can go over $1,000, then the 4080 starts to be worth considering. And at least in all of my testing here, we rarely saw I think we saw the 4080 frequently tied, and then when you're enabling features like ray tracing with a bit of a lead, and then there are heavier ray tracing and upscaling titles where you get a bit more of advantage. So what you really need to decide is it worth the extra, $150 or so to get the better upscaling and ray tracing performance? Is it worth it to you? Probably depends a lot on the games you play, the resolution you play at, things like that. Because interestingly, well, I think the ray tracing is more usable at 1440p performance-wise. At 4K, it's a bit less usable. Although then maybe the upscaling might be more required, that kind of thing. I don't know, guys. I really don't hate either of these GPUs. I do hate the price of both of them. I would love to see both of these have a few $100s knocked off their prices, just overall. I do think that the 7900 XTX is the best card under $1,000. I think the 4080 is a better GPU. I think it's going to be up to you whether you think the extra $150 is justified as part of that upgrade. Anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. What do you guys think in the comments section? Because again, this isn't comparing two GPUs that cost the same amount of money. Those are easier comparisons to make. These are GPUs that don't cost the same. I do think the 4080 is a bit better, and it costs more. I think the 7900 XTX is great, and if you're not planning on using heavy ray tracing and upscaling, then it's basically getting you the same thing for less money and more VRAM. So there is certainly an argument to be made for it. I think I've rambled on long enough, but expect future videos comparing other high-end GPUs coming from me very soon. I did test all of these. We'll look at these against the 4090. We'll also look at the 7900 XT and the 4070 Ti, 4070 up against, I did re-benchmark my 6800 XT and my 6950 XT as well to look up against those. So basically I'm revisiting the whole high-end market. So if you'd like to subscribe to the channel to be, maybe notified by YouTube, I don't even know how much subscriptions matter for notifications. You can always hit the notify bell, but whatever. Anyway, a huge thank you to people who have subscribed, and stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in that upcoming content. And especially huge thank you to people who have clicked the join button to directly financially support the channel. You are all beautiful people, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.